So I myself has previously received an award from Aplastic Anemia and MDS International Foundation. So this was for my postdoctoral work studying new genetic changes that develop in the bone marrow of patients with aplastic anemia, and particularly in kids. So that work really started my current area of investigation, and then it continues in the research also that was just awarded for my postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Sushan Kumar. So in those previous studies supported by AAMDSIF, we looked at bone marrow, at new genetic changes that occurred in the bone marrow of patients with aplastic anemia. We focused primarily on kids who developed aplastic anemia, but we also have had a cohort of adults. And so in that work, we found that, and at that point it was very surprising to us. Although now I think we all accepted this, and it seems that perhaps this is something that should have been predicted up front. But what we found is that the bone marrow of patients with aplastic anemia accumulates new genetic changes. And this is not just in adults or older adults, but we can also see these new genetic mutations that develop in the bone marrow of children with aplastic anemia. And this happens, we found that in over 2/3 of patients develop these genetic changes. The big question is it something that, for example, would lead to myelodysplastic syndrome or leukemia down the line? And the answer is probably not. So in fact, we found there are different patterns of genetic changes that occur in patients with aplastic anemia as compared to myelodysplastic syndrome for the most part. So the top genetic changes that occur are actually, there are mutations disrupting the gene called PIGA. So these are the mutations that also lead to PNH clones, and that is how aplastic anemia is tied to this disease, PNH. And then the second most common genetic change is actually loss of these specific immune genes called human leukocyte antigen or HLA genes. And so that discovery really opened a new area of investigation that we are currently pursuing in the lab, where we look at basically some of these predisposition genes. So some of these immune genes that appear to be really instrumental to the onset of aplastic anemia. So in regard to other ongoing studies in my lab, our studies really stem from those initial findings of the specificity of immune attack in aplastic anemia, and we're pursuing it in two ways. So one of them is the study specifically looking at these HLA factors that predispose patients to developing aplastic anemia in the first place, and perhaps also influencing some of the complications down the line. So, for example, one of our recent observations was that there's a subgroup of patients with some of these genetic immune genes, so some of these HLA genes that basically predispose patients to develop changes associated with progression to myelodysplastic syndrome, which is particularly seems to happen in adults. So that is certainly one major finding from this work. And then the second area of investigation in the lab is focusing specifically on PNH. And so that really takes a whole fresh look at why do PNH cells emerge in patients with aplastic anemia? What is the connection between the two? And is it, so one of the overarching hypotheses, both for my lab and also in the field, is that these PNH cells emerge by escaping the immune attack in aplastic anemia. And so they're sort of a byproduct of that autoimmune bone marrow environment. And so in our work, and the work that was recently supported by AAMDS IF for Sushant Kumar in my lab specifically looks at the interaction between these HLA alleles that we think are important in aplastic anemia, and how immune presentation through these HLA alleles occurs specifically in PNH cells. So that is very, I think a very interesting area and completely unanswered so far. And we look forward to updating the community about our work in the upcoming years. With COVID years, it has been incredibly disruptive, not just to my laboratory, but really, I think it's affected many investigators across the board. And so certainly it didn't stop us, and we are going very strong and recovering, but some of the impact that COVID has had on the research community, both in basic research as well as in clinical research, is that first, during the initial phases, many of the labs were mandatorily closed during due to both the social distancing mandates and the quarantine and the shutdown that occurred. A lot of some of the human sample collection, so we have a very big patient registry and sample repository of patients with bone marrow failure, from where we get some of the samples for our work on aplastic anemia and PNH. Some of that sample collection has also been difficult, both because of the switch to telemedicine and also just the human sample processing. And then other factors are funding. So funding has been also very difficult, I think, for not just for my lab, but just in general, that funding has been incredibly tight. And I think there's going to be, unfortunately, many repercussions just in research. So the grants, such as the ones that are provided by AAMDSIF, are incredibly valuable, and they can both foster new careers and they can sustain careers of the established investigators to sort of weather some of this disruption and really do research that matters to our patients, and specifically for patients with rare disorders, where funding sometimes is a little more difficult to come by, but the research is so badly needed. I am very proud of Dr. Sushant Kumar, who is a postdoctoral fellow who just recently joined my lab and recently received the grant from the Aplastic Anemia and MDS International Foundation, as well as Uplifting Athletes Award. Myself, I am a physician and I am a scientist, and I treat patients with aplastic anemia and with PNH, and I see the struggles that my patients face, and I very much see the needs of the patients and how inadequate some of our therapies still are, despite a lot of progress that has been made. And knowing that, it is so important for us as a field to attract additional investigators, right, to make progress. And so the progress is only made when we have qualified people who are interested, enthusiastic, and they're working together to try to address some of these unsolved problems. And being for aplastic anemia and for PNH being such rare disorders, it frequently is difficult to get a lot of investigators who are really truly interested and committed to this career in the long term. So thinking about Dr. Sushant Kumar in particular, it is incredibly gratifying to me to see investigators such as him, who are very highly trained and very accomplished, in particular in Dr. Kumar's case in immunology, who are interested in trying to address some of these unsolved problems. And just thinking of how do investigators get into the field, frequently it is through mentorship. So for example, thinking of this as a path, I myself was supported previously by Aplastic Anemia and MDS International Foundation. I was in my own postdoctoral research, I was in the lab of my mentor, Dr. Monica Bessler, who also was a physician scientist, also in doing research on aplastic anemia and other bone marrow failure syndromes and PNH as well. And thinking even further back, Dr. Bessler herself initially trained in the lab of Dr. Lucio Luzzatto, who is also a specialist in a very renowned investigator in PNH. Thus, I think it's incredibly important to foster both the labs and then the mentorship. And so, for myself, I take a lot of pride in, and I truly commit to mentoring the new generation. So, and really, in my lab, of course, such as with Dr. Kumar and other of my trainees who are students and postdocs, but also in other areas. So, for example, as a physician, I interact with many of the so physician trainees, both medical students, residents, fellows in hematology, oncology, and sometimes it's just the exposure. These are very rare disorders, and many physicians may not even see a case of aplastic anemia or PNH in their training, and thus it's incredibly important to introduce this and really cultivate both the knowledge but also an expertise and interest. And then similarly, I also teach in graduate school. So for example, in immunology, in our immunology graduate studies, where we certainly need individuals who have, who are highly trained immunology scientists to try to look at this problem in what is essentially an autoimmune disease that remains highly understudied. And then additionally, other areas where, we all as physicians and as scientists do, where we contribute to bringing people into the field is even, in patient, right? So patient seminars, and including, for example, some of the education seminars that Aplastic Anemia and MDS Foundation is providing. So I think it's right. So it's very important to both foster, to foster our trainees, and again, this award from Aplastic Anemia and MDS Foundation and the Uplifting Athletes for Dr. Kumar will go a long way to him, really, I think, to capturing his interest in the field and promoting his long-term interest in the field.